Hey everyone, glad you're back again this week as we continue our lesson series on the book of Matthew. Now, in the lesson today, we're going to be looking at an event that is really incredibly important to believers today. Now, I'm talking about the death of John the Baptist. While there's actually many lessons that we can learn from this event, over this week and the next lesson that I'll be teaching, we're only going to focus on two particular lessons. So this begins in Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 13. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard about the fame of Jesus, and he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has been raised from the dead, and that is why these miraculous powers are at work in him." For Herod had seized John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And though he wanted to put him to death, he feared the people because they held him to be a prophet. They held John to be a prophet. But when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias, her name was Salome, the daughter of Herodias danced before the company and pleased Herod, so that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me the head of John the Baptist here on a platter." And the king was sorry, but because of his oaths and his guest, he commanded it to be given. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And his disciples, John's disciples, came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. Now, the first thing that we see in this event is John calling out Herod for his sin. That was Herod Antipas. Herod Antipas had a brother, Herod Philip. And both of these men were sons of Herod the Great. So we have Herod the Great. He has two sons, Herod Antipas, Herod Philip. Philip had married a woman called Herodias. Now, I'm going to say called Herodias instead of named Herodias, because Herodias is really just the feminine form of the name Herod. She was of the Herodian family. So to clarify all this, we start with Herod the Great. Now that is King Herod, who was famous for having the babies in Bethlehem killed, as recorded in Matthew chapter 2. And the Roman Senate gave him the authority or the title of king over Judea, this region around Jerusalem. And important to this story, Herod the Great had several children and grandchildren. Now, we've already talked about it. He had two sons, Antipas and Philip had married Herodias, which was actually his niece. And Philip and Herodias had a daughter, like I said, her name was Salome. Antipas, Philip's brother, decided that he wanted to have Herodias for his own wife one time when he went and visited. However, Antipas was already married. So what Antipas did was he divorced his wife and married Philip's wife. Now, Herodias was probably in favor of this because the territory that Herod Antipas had was a greater, richer territory than the territory Herod Philip had. And so it gives you an indication of her mindset. She was in this for the power, for the fame, for the riches. And so she married Antipas. The problem is that Jewish law didn't permit this. In Leviticus 18, verse 16, it says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife." In Leviticus 20, verse 21, it says, "If a man takes his brother's wife, it is an impurity." So as long as Philip was alive, Antipas was forbidden to marry and engage in any type of sexual relationship with Philip's wife, regardless of his own marital status. I mean, even if Antipas had divorced his wife, he still couldn't marry his brother's wife. This is what John was was calling out. This was the sin that John was calling out. In Matthew 14, verse 4, it says, John had been saying to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. Now, you may say, well, what does it matter? Antipas wasn't a Jew. Why would John try to hold him to Jewish law? Well, Antipas was kind of a Jew. The Herodian family were from Edom. They were Edomites. These were the descendants of Esau. So if you remember Jacob and Esau from the Old Testament, they were descendants of Esau. The Jews were descendants of Jacob, and the Edomites were descendants of Esau. So the Herodian family technically were not what you would call Jews. Jews, again, were from the tribe of Judah, Judah being the son of Jacob. Now, really, at this time, anyone who was a descendant of Jacob was considered a Jew, regardless of the tribe from which he or she originated. However, Herod the Great's father had converted to Judaism and sort of brought his family into the fold of the Jews. Herod the Great had been raised as a Jew. So the Herod family was a Jewish family, or at least in name. Most Jews at the time did not think they were Jewish enough to be ruling over the Jews, but they were Jewish enough to be held to Jewish law. So when Antipas, a Jew, took his brother's wife, who really was his niece, also a Jew, John called out this as a violation of Jewish law. It's important to understand that John wasn't just calling out some ruler. Today in the Christian era, it would be like a U.S. senator or a U.S. president who was a professing Christian to be living a public life of adultery. That sort of sets the stage for our first lesson in this story. The church needs to learn from this. No, the church doesn't need to become involved in every sin committed by every politician. Paul is clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 that we as believers do not need to be judging the actions of the world. That's for God to do. However, when a person dares to call himself or herself a Christian and is serving in a position of power in the government and is also living a life that is marked by public sin, the church should follow John's example and call that person out. Not just the sin. The person should be called out for the sin. You see, John didn't go around telling people that, well, marrying your brother's wife is against the law. He tied a name to that violation. He marched into the king's court and called him out personally and publicly. Now, I don't know if he really walked into Antipas's court, but you kind of know what I mean. Now, today in the church, we're sometimes pretty good at calling out sin, but we're fearful of calling out the sinner, especially if he or she is a powerful government figure. And I think a lot of times this has to do with offending those in the congregation that like a particular politician. And preachers don't want to offend their congregation. It also seems to be tied to this tax-exempt status of the church. The church is supposed to stay away from politics in order to keep its tax-exempt status. And many pastors don't want to get too specific in their criticism of politicians, I think in fear of becoming a target for the government. But I want you to notice, John didn't seem to care about any of that. He didn't care if he offended someone by calling out the sinner in power, nor did he care if that person in power took offense and targeted him in return. I mean, that's exactly what happened. He was targeted for it. He was killed for it. However, church leaders, teachers, pastors in America need to learn from that. We need to get a backbone and call out Christian sinners when their lives become a poor public example for others to follow. Now you may say, well, what about everyone else that is doing the same thing as the politician? Well, there is a difference between someone who has not taken a position of power in the government and someone that has. You want to call yourself a Christian and hold a position of public power and authority? Then you need to live as an example to Christians around the world. Now, that doesn't mean you need to be called out for every little thing that you have done wrong in your past. I mean, your past is your past. But what you do in your present needs to be exemplary. Or you need to step down from your position of power. Hey, I hope you all have a great rest of the week, and I will see you next time as we continue our series in the book of Matthew. Bye-bye.